Marcus Stone had built his empire on ruthless precision. At 42, he controlled a tech conglomerate worth billions, his name whispered in boardrooms across Silicon Valley with equal parts reverence and fear. His corner office on the 57th floor overlooked a city he'd helped reshape, but Marcus rarely bothered with the view anymore. Success had become mechanical, relationships transactional, and love. Well, love was a luxury he couldn't afford. That Tuesday started like any other. His assistant Sarah briefed him on quarterly projections while he signed documents without reading them. His ex-wife Claire had called 3 times, something about their daughter Emma's graduation, but Marcus let it go to voicemail. Emma was probably fine. She had to be. After all, she was his daughter, and stones didn't break easily. At least, that's what he told himself as he dismissed another call from her school counselor. The experimental surgery was supposed to be routine. A minor procedure to remove a brain tumor that his doctors assured him was benign. Marcus had scheduled it between board meetings, treating it like just another business appointment. He'd told no one except his lawyer, who needed to update some paperwork, and Sarah, who had to reschedule his afternoon. Even facing his own mortality, Marcus Stone remained an island. As the anesthesia took hold, Marcus felt an unusual sense of peace. For the first time in years, his mind wasn't racing through profit margins and hostile takeovers. He was simply letting go. The last thing he remembered was the steady beep of the heart monitor, growing fainter and fainter until silence claimed him. But death, as it turned out, was not the end Marcus had expected. Instead of darkness or bright lights, he found himself standing in the hospital corridor, watching doctors rush around his body with desperate urgency. He could see everything: the frantic attempts at resuscitation, the grim expressions, the final moment when Dr. Peterson called the time of death. Yet somehow, he was still there, still conscious, still himself. The strangest part wasn't being dead. It was realizing that his first thought wasn't about the company, the deals he'd never close, or the fortune he'd leave behind. His first thought was a crushing regret that he'd never called Emma back, never heard what she'd wanted to tell him about graduation. For a man who'd spent decades prioritizing everything over family, this revelation hit harder than any hostile takeover he'd ever faced. Over the next 3 days, Marcus discovered he could move freely through the world, invisible to everyone around him. He watched Sarah break the news to his executive team, their shock quickly giving way to calculated discussions about succession plans. He observed his board members, some genuinely saddened, others already maneuvering for power in the vacuum he'd left behind. The business world mourned Marcus Stone for exactly 47 minutes before moving on to the next opportunity. But it was the personal reactions that truly shattered him. Claire, his ex-wife, didn't cry when she received the call. Instead, she held Emma close and whispered, "I'm sorry, baby. I'm so sorry you never got to really know your father." 17-year-old Emma didn't break down either. She just stared at the wall and said, "I kept hoping he'd call me back. I had something important to tell him." The weight of those words crushed Marcus in ways that market crashes and business failures never could. His funeral was set for Friday at the Cathedral of Saints Peter and Paul, a venue chosen more for its prestige than any religious significance in Marcus's life. As Thursday evening approached, he found himself drawn to the cathedral, curious about who would attend, what they would say, how they would remember the man he'd been. What he discovered there would change everything he thought he knew about love, loss, and the true measure of a life well lived. Standing in the empty cathedral, Marcus realized he was about to witness something no living person ever could: his own funeral, seen through the eyes of everyone he'd left behind. He had no way of knowing that this experience would reveal not just how he'd lived, but who he'd failed to love, and perhaps most importantly, who had loved him despite everything. The first person to arrive at Marcus's funeral was someone he didn't recognize, an elderly janitor from his office building. The man, whose name tag read Roberto, sat quietly in the back pew, clutching a worn photograph. Curious, Marcus moved closer and saw it was a picture of a young woman in a nurse's uniform. Roberto whispered to the empty cathedral, "Mr. Stone, you probably never knew, but when my Maria was sick, you covered her medical bills. Your assistant said it was company policy, but I know better. There is no policy for janitors' sick wives. You saved her life. and I never got to thank you." Marcus stared in shock. He vaguely remembered Sarah mentioning something about employee hardship cases, but he'd never paid attention to the details. He'd simply told her to handle whatever needed handling. Yet here was a man whose life he'd apparently touched without even realizing it, sitting alone in a cathedral, mourning him with genuine tears. More people began filtering in, and Marcus recognized faces from his company. Junior executives, secretaries, male clerks. But it was their stories, whispered to each other as they took their seats, that began painting a picture of a man Marcus didn't recognize as himself. Linda from accounting told her friend about the scholarship Marcus had quietly funded for her son. David from IT mentioned how Marcus had personally intervened when David was facing deportation, using company lawyers to help him get citizenship. Story after story emerged of kindnesses Marcus had authorized but never followed up on, acts of generosity he'd delegated and forgotten. Then Claire arrived with Emma, and Marcus's heart broke all over again. His daughter looked beautiful in her black dress, but her eyes were red from crying. Claire held her hand tightly as they walked down the aisle, and Marcus could see the strength his ex-wife was drawing on to hold herself together for their daughter's sake. They sat in the front row, reserved for family, and the space around them felt enormous and empty. Marcus's business associates filled the cathedral's center section, board members, rival CEOs, politicians, and celebrities who'd been part of his social circle. They spoke in hushed tones about merger possibilities and market implications of his death. These were the people Marcus had thought mattered most, yet listening to them now, he realized their presence was performative, obligatory. They were there to be seen, not to mourn. But it was the third group that surprised him most. Teachers from Emma's school, neighbors from the house he'd shared with Claire years ago, college friends he'd lost touch with, his old mentor Professor Williams from business school, people from his past, from before success had hardened him into someone unrecognizable. They'd all come to say goodbye to the Marcus they remembered, the one who'd existed before ambition consumed everything else. As the service began, Marcus positioned himself near the altar, wanting to hear every word. The pastor, whom Marcus had met only once during the planning, spoke generically about success and achievement. Then came the eulogies, and Marcus braced himself for hollow corporate speak about his business acumen and market vision. Instead, Sarah took the podium first. His assistant of 12 years, who'd seen him at his worst and somehow stayed loyal, spoke with a trembling voice. "Marcus Stone was a complicated man," she began. "He could be demanding, sometimes harsh, always exacting. But he was also the person who made sure every employee's child had a Christmas present, even if he never took credit for it. He was the man who quietly donated millions to children's hospitals while lecturing others about tax efficiency. He built walls around his heart, but somehow love still leaked through the cracks." Marcus watched, stunned, as Sarah described acts of kindness he'd completely forgotten or never consciously acknowledged. The company Christmas parties he'd funded but never attended. The college tuition payments for employees' children that he'd authorized with barely a glance. The disaster relief funds he'd established and quietly maintained. She painted the picture of a man who'd done enormous good while seemingly trying his hardest not to let anyone, including himself, notice. Then Emma stood up. His 17-year-old daughter, who he'd barely spoken to in months, walked to the podium with the poise of someone far older. "My father was supposed to be here for my graduation next week," she began, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "I've been trying to call him for weeks because I wanted him to know that I got into MIT. I wanted to study computer science, like him. I wanted to tell him that despite everything, despite how little time we spent together, he was still my hero." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. Emma had gotten into MIT, his alma mater, the place where he'd first dreamed of changing the world. She'd wanted to follow in his footsteps, and he'd been too busy, too distracted, too buried in his own success to even take her call. He'd missed the most important moment in his daughter's life because he'd convinced himself that providing for her financially was the same as being present for her emotionally. Emma continued, "I used to be angry at him for working so much, for missing school plays and birthday parties. But I realize now that he was trying to build something bigger than himself. Mom always said he worked so hard because he loved us so much, He wanted to make sure we'd never want for anything. I just wish I could have told him that all I ever wanted was more time with him." As Emma returned to her seat, Marcus saw Claire reach over and squeeze their daughter's hand. In that moment, he understood something that had eluded him for years. Love wasn't about the size of the trust fund he'd established for Emma or the expensive schools he'd sent her to. Love was about showing up, being present, taking the call when your daughter needed to share the most important news of her young life. The revelation continued to unfold as more people spoke. His old professor talked about the idealistic young man who'd entered his classroom 25 years ago, determined to use technology to make the world better. College friends shared stories of late-night conversations about changing society, about using business as a force for good. They spoke of dreams Marcus had forgotten he'd ever had, of a version of himself that ambition had slowly erased. But it was the final speaker who broke him completely. Claire stood up and walked to the podium, and Marcus could see the internal struggle she was fighting. She looked out at the gathered crowd, then directly at the space where Marcus stood, as if she could somehow sense his presence. "Marcus was the love of my life," she said simply. "Not because our marriage was perfect, it wasn't. Not because he was always there when we needed him, he wasn't. But because underneath all that ambition, all that drive, all those walls he built around himself, was the most caring, generous, loving man I've ever known. He just forgot how to let people see it." Claire's voice broke as she continued. "The last time we spoke, he was rushing to another meeting. I wanted to tell him that Emma had been struggling, that she needed her father. I wanted to tell him that I still loved him, that I'd never stopped loving him, that success meant nothing if you couldn't share it with the people who mattered most. But he was already gone, already focused on the next deal, the next opportunity. I kept thinking we'd have time to fix things, to find our way back to each other. I thought we'd have time." Marcus watched his ex-wife break down at the podium, and he realized that the greatest tragedy of his death wasn't the empire he'd leave behind or the deals that would never close. It was the love he'd been too blind to see, too busy to nurture, too afraid to acknowledge. Claire still loved him. Emma had wanted to share her dreams with him. His employees had seen glimpses of the man he could have been. He'd been surrounded by love his entire life, and he'd been too focused on success to notice. As the service ended and people began filing out, Marcus remained frozen at the altar, overwhelmed by the weight of what he'd witnessed. His funeral hadn't been a celebration of his achievements or a recognition of his wealth. It had been a mourning for the man he could have been, the relationships he'd neglected, the love he'd pushed away in pursuit of something far less valuable than what he'd already had. In the days following his funeral, Marcus found himself drawn to the lives of the people who'd spoken about him, compelled to understand the depth of what he'd missed while he was alive. He followed Roberto home to a small apartment where the janitor sat with his wife Maria, showing her the funeral program and telling her about the service. Maria, still weak from her recent illness, smiled through her tears and said, "I knew he was a good man. Good men don't hide their kindness, they just don't realize how bright it shines." Marcus watched this elderly couple, married for 43 years, as they held hands and shared stories about their children and grandchildren. Their apartment was tiny, filled with hand-me-down furniture and family photographs, but it radiated more warmth and love than his penthouse ever had. Roberto worked nights cleaning offices so he could spend days caring for Maria, and their devotion to each other was so pure, so complete, that Marcus felt ashamed of how easily he discarded his own marriage when it became inconvenient to his ambitions. He followed Sarah home next, to a modest house where she lived with her teenage son. Marcus had never asked about her personal life, never inquired about her family or her struggles as a single mother. Now he watched her help her son with homework, listened as she patiently explained algebra concepts while dinner cooked on the stove. The boy, who looked about 15, asked about the funeral, and Sarah's response stunned Marcus. "Mr. Stone was complicated, honey. He could be difficult to work for, but he was generous in ways most people never saw. When you needed that surgery 3 years ago, and our insurance wouldn't cover it, he personally made sure it was paid for. He never mentioned it, never made me feel like I owed him anything. That's the kind of man he really was. He just forgot how to let people see his heart." Marcus remembered that time vaguely. Sarah had been distracted, worried about something, and he'd told her to handle whatever personal issue was affecting her work. He'd had no idea her son had needed surgery, no idea that his casual instruction to fix it had saved a child's life. The realization that he'd been performing acts of genuine goodness without even being conscious of it made him wonder how many other opportunities for real connection he'd missed by operating on autopilot. But it was visiting Emma that truly broke his heart. His daughter's room was filled with reminders of a father who'd been more absence than presence. There were newspaper clippings about his business achievements pinned to a corkboard, photos of the two of them from when she was younger and he'd occasionally attended school events. On her desk was a half-written letter that began, "Dear Dad, I know you're busy, but I really need to talk to you about something important." Marcus read over Emma's shoulder as she continued writing the letter she'd never get to send. In it, she told him about getting into MIT, about her dreams of starting her own tech company, about wanting to make him proud. But she also wrote about feeling abandoned, about watching other fathers at school events and wondering why work was always more important than she was. The letter was raw, honest, and filled with a love so deep it had survived years of neglect. "I used to pretend you were a superhero," she wrote. "That's why you were always gone. You were out saving the world. I told my friends that's what CEOs do, they fix things for everyone else. I just never understood why you couldn't fix things between us. I kept hoping that someday you'd retire, or slow down, or just realize that I needed you too. I guess I'll never know if that day would have come." Emma's pain was so raw, so immediate, that Marcus felt it like a physical wound. She'd created elaborate fantasies to justify his absence, had built a mythology around his work to make sense of why he'd chosen everything else over her. And the cruelest part was that she'd been right. He had been trying to save the world, in his own way, but he'd been too blind to see that his own daughter needed saving most of all. That night, Marcus found himself in Claire's apartment. His ex-wife was sitting at her kitchen table with photo albums spread around her, going through pictures of their life together. She lingered on images from their early years, their wedding day, Emma's birth, family vacations before work consumed everything. Claire was crying softly, not just for his death, but for the marriage they'd lost long before it officially ended. Marcus watched her trace his face in a photograph from Emma's 5th birthday party. He remembered that day. He'd left early for a conference call, missing Emma's reaction to the dollhouse he'd bought her. In the photo, Claire was holding Emma, both of them looking at where he should have been standing. Even then, his absence had been more noticeable than his presence. Claire opened her laptop and began typing what looked like an email. Marcus read over her shoulder as she wrote to her sister, "I keep thinking about all the ways I failed him too. I was so angry about the divorce, so hurt by his constant absence, that I stopped trying to reach him. I could have fought harder for our marriage, could have made him understand what he was losing. Instead, I let my pride win, and now it's too late. Emma needed her father, and I could have found a way to make that happen. I was so focused on protecting myself from more disappointment that I didn't protect what we could have salvaged." The weight of mutual responsibility in their failed marriage hit Marcus like a revelation. He'd blamed the divorce on incompatible life goals, on Claire's inability to understand the demands of his success. But reading her words, he realized she'd been fighting for their family while he'd been building his empire. She'd needed a partner, and he'd been too consumed with being a provider to understand the difference. Marcus spent the next few days observing the ripple effects of his death throughout his company. Board meetings that should have been about mourning instead focused on stock prices and succession plans. The charitable foundation he'd established, something he'd barely paid attention to while alive, was being dismantled by executives who saw it as an unnecessary expense. Programs that had helped hundreds of employees and their families were being cut in the name of efficiency. But it was watching his replacement, a ruthless executive named Davidson, that truly opened Marcus's eyes to what he'd become. Davidson immediately began laying off older employees, cutting benefits, and eliminating the soft programs that Marcus had unconsciously maintained. Watching Davidson operate was like seeing himself from the outside, efficient, profitable, and completely devoid of humanity. Sarah requested a meeting with Davidson to discuss the employee assistance programs, and Marcus watched his former assistant fight for things he'd never realized she'd been protecting. When Davidson dismissed her concerns as sentimental nonsense, Sarah's response surprised everyone in the room, including Marcus. Mr. Stone may have seemed cold, but he understood that a company is made of people, not just profit margins. These programs didn't make us weak. They made us loyal. Employees didn't work for Marcus Stone because they feared him. They worked for him because they knew he saw them as human beings, even when he forgot to show it. As Sarah cleaned out her desk after being fired for insubordination, Marcus realized she'd been the guardian of his better angels, the person who'd translated his unconscious compassion into concrete action. She'd been protecting the parts of him that success had buried, and now that protection was gone. The awakening was complete when Marcus returned to the cemetery where his body was buried. Standing at his own gravestone, he understood that death had given him the one thing his life had lacked: perspective. He'd spent 42 years building a legacy of success, but the only legacy that mattered was love, and he'd been too busy to notice how much of it had surrounded him. The inscription on his headstone read, Marcus Stone, Visionary Leader, 1982 to 2024. But as Marcus looked at those words, he realized they told the story of what he'd done, not who he'd been. The real Marcus Stone, the one who'd quietly helped Roberto's wife, who'd funded Sarah's son's surgery, who'd inspired Emma to pursue her dreams even from a distance. That man wasn't buried in the cemetery. That man had been alive all along, hidden beneath layers of ambition and fear, waiting for someone to love him enough to call him home. Standing in the gathering darkness, Marcus understood that his death wasn't an ending, it was a beginning. Because for the first time in years, he could see clearly what truly mattered, and he finally understood what love really meant. The revelation at his graveside marked the beginning of Marcus's true transformation. As weeks passed in his ghostly existence, he began to see patterns in his life that had been invisible while he was alive. Every major decision, every sacrifice he'd made for his career, every relationship he'd damaged in pursuit of success, they all connected in ways that made him understand how profoundly he'd misunderstood the purpose of his own life. Marcus found himself drawn back to his childhood home, a modest house in a working-class neighborhood where his parents had raised him with love and high expectations. His mother had died 5 years ago, and his father 3 years before that, both funerals attended by Marcus in expensive suits and expensive cars, rushing through grief as if it were just another item on his schedule. Now, standing in the empty house that new owners had renovated beyond recognition, Marcus remembered conversations with his father that he'd dismissed as old-fashioned wisdom. "Success isn't about how much you accumulate, son," his father had said during one of their last conversations. "It's about how much you contribute. And the greatest contribution you can make is to love people well." Marcus had nodded politely while checking his phone, treating his father's words as quaint philosophy from a simpler time. Now he understood that his father had been trying to save him from exactly the kind of life he'd ended up living. His parents had immigrated from nothing, built a small but loving family, worked honest jobs, and found joy in simple things: Sunday dinners, holiday traditions, watching their son graduate from college. They'd measured their success not in stock options or market share, but in the love they'd shared and the values they'd passed down. Marcus had taken their foundation and built an empire on it, but somewhere in the construction, he'd forgotten why he was building in the first place. The transformation accelerated when Marcus began following Emma through her daily life. His daughter was struggling with his death in ways that broke his heart. She'd throw herself into college preparation during the day, maintaining perfect grades and leading study groups, but at night she'd cry herself to sleep while looking at old photos of the two of them. She'd developed a ritual of calling his old phone number just to hear his voicemail greeting, a desperate attempt to maintain some connection to the father she'd lost before she ever really had him. Marcus watched Emma write college essays about overcoming adversity, about learning independence from an absent father, about finding strength in disappointment. Her pain was transforming into purpose, but the cost was a cynicism that reminded Marcus too much of himself. She was building walls around her heart, just as he had, protecting herself from future abandonment by never fully trusting anyone again. The most heartbreaking moment came when Emma met with her guidance counselor about her college plans. When asked about her career goals, Emma responded with mechanical precision, "I want to build a tech company that helps people. But I won't make the same mistakes my father made. I won't let success cost me the people I love." She was 17 years old and already planning a life defined by her father's failures. Marcus realized he'd given her a legacy of caution instead of confidence, fear instead of freedom. But it was watching Claire that completed Marcus's understanding of what he'd lost. His ex-wife was trying to rebuild her life at 40, dating again for the first time since their divorce. Marcus observed her on awkward coffee dates with kind men who were clearly smitten with her intelligence and grace. Yet Claire held back, never fully engaging, never allowing herself to be vulnerable. During one particularly promising dinner, her date asked why her marriage had ended, and Claire's response cut Marcus to the core. "I fell in love with a man who had incredible capacity for love but didn't know how to access it. He could move mountains for strangers but couldn't sit still for his own family. I kept waiting for him to remember how to be present, how to choose us over everything else. I waited 15 years, and he never came home, not really. I can't risk that kind of love again, the kind that asks you to believe someone will change when all evidence suggests they won't." Marcus watched Claire end promising relationships before they could hurt her, saw her maintain careful distance from men who might have loved her completely. His inability to prioritize his marriage hadn't just cost him a wife. It had taught Claire that love was dangerous, that commitment was unreliable, that hoping for change was a fool's game. Even in death, his choices were limiting her capacity for happiness. The transformation reached its peak when Marcus witnessed a conversation between Emma and Claire about his memorial scholarship fund. The company had established it as a public relations gesture, but Claire and Emma were debating whether to accept the corporate board's offer to manage it together. Emma was hesitant, not wanting anything to do with the business that had consumed her father. Claire was torn between honoring his memory and protecting their daughter from his world. "Mom, what if we're just perpetuating the same cycle?" Emma asked. "What if managing Dad's money just makes us like him, so focused on the foundation that we forget about each other?" Claire's response revealed the depth of wisdom she'd gained from their failed marriage. "The difference, sweetheart, is that we know the cost. Your father built something meaningful, but he forgot to live meaningfully while he was building it. We can honor what he created without repeating his mistakes. We can use his resources to help people while still being present for each other." In that moment, Marcus understood that his death had given Claire and Emma something his life never had: clarity about what truly mattered. They were taking his legacy and transforming it into something he'd never managed to create: a balance between achievement and love, between building something larger than themselves and remaining connected to each other. The final piece of Marcus's transformation came when he returned to his old office building late one night. The space had been renovated, his personal belongings packed away, all traces of his occupancy erased. But in the security guard's booth, he found Roberto working his night shift, still carrying the photograph of his wife Maria. Marcus watched Roberto's routine, checking doors, monitoring cameras, cleaning floors with the same quiet dignity he'd always shown. But tonight, Roberto paused in what used to be Marcus's office and spoke to the empty room. "Mr. Stone, I know you can't hear me, but I wanted you to know that Maria is doing well. The doctors say she's going to be fine. You saved her life, and I promise you, we won't waste the time you gave us. Every day is a gift now, and we're going to love each other well with whatever time we have left." The simplicity and profound gratitude in Roberto's words completed Marcus's transformation. This man, who had so little by material standards, understood everything that Marcus had missed. Roberto knew that time was precious, that love was the only currency that mattered, that every day was an opportunity to choose connection over isolation. Standing in his empty office, Marcus finally understood the man he could have been. He'd had all the resources, all the opportunities, all the love surrounding him that Roberto had, but he'd been too blind to see it, too busy to nurture it, too afraid to trust it. Success hadn't corrupted him, it had simply amplified the fears that had always driven him, the belief that he had to earn love through achievement rather than simply accept it through presence. The transformation was complete, but Marcus realized it had come too late. He was a ghost watching the consequences of a life lived unconsciously, seeing clearly now what had been invisible when clarity could have made a difference. Or so he thought, until something extraordinary began to happen that would give him one final chance to choose love over fear, connection over isolation, presence over productivity. 3 months after his funeral, something unprecedented occurred. Marcus, who had existed as an observer in his ghostly state, began to feel a strange pulling sensation, as if reality itself was shifting around him. The world grew brighter, sounds became clearer, and for the first time since his death, he felt truly present rather than merely watching. He found himself standing in the same hospital room where he had died, but now the space felt alive with possibility rather than ending. Dr. Peterson was there, along with a team of specialists, gathered around monitoring equipment that Marcus didn't recognize. Through fragments of their conversation, he pieced together an incredible truth. His body had been preserved through an experimental cryogenic process, part of a cutting-edge research program he'd funded years earlier and completely forgotten about. The doctors had been working tirelessly to repair the brain damage that had caused his death, and incredibly, impossibly, they had succeeded. The neural pathways are regenerating faster than we anticipated, Dr. Peterson was saying to his colleague. It's as if his consciousness has been waiting, preserved somehow. I've never seen anything like this recovery pattern. Marcus watched, stunned, as his own body showed signs of returning life. Heart rate stabilizing, brain activity increasing, the slow but unmistakable return of the man he had been. But he was no longer that man, not entirely. The months of witnessing his own funeral, of seeing the impact of his choices, of understanding the depth of love he'd rejected, all of that awareness remained intact as his spirit prepared to reunite with his physical form. The moment of reconnection was like lightning striking in reverse. Instead of a sudden shock, Marcus felt a gentle settling, like coming home after a long journey. He opened his eyes and his body for the first time in 3 months, and the first word he spoke was not about his company, his wealth, or his empire. It was, Emma. Dr. Peterson's team was amazed by his rapid recovery, but Marcus barely paid attention to their medical explanations. He had been given something impossible. A second chance, a literal resurrection, an opportunity to live the life he should have lived the first time. But he also understood that this gift came with enormous responsibility. He knew things now that no living person should know. He had seen his own funeral, witnessed the true impact of his choices, understood the cost of love deferred. The first call Marcus made was not to his board of directors or his executive team. It was to Claire, and when she answered, the sound of her voice nearly broke him. "Claire, it's Marcus," he said, his voice hoarse from months of disuse. "I know this is impossible, I know you probably think I'm dead, but I need you to know, I remember everything. I remember what you said at my funeral. I remember that you still love me. And I need you to know that I love you too, and I'm sorry it took dying for me to remember how to say it." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for an eternity before Claire whispered, "This isn't possible. Marcus is dead. I went to his funeral. I buried him. I know you did. I was there. I heard every word you said, every word Emma said, every story people told about me. Claire, I've been given a second chance, and I'm not going to waste it. I'm not going to be the man I was before. I'm going to be the man you deserved, the father Emma needed, the person I was always capable of being but was too scared to become." When Claire and Emma arrived at the hospital 3 hours later, Marcus was sitting up in bed, looking like a man reborn in the most literal sense. Emma ran to him first, throwing her arms around him with 17 years of stored-up love and grief. "Dad, I got into MIT, she sobbed against his shoulder. "I've been trying to tell you for months." "I know, sweetheart," Marcus whispered, holding his daughter for the first time since she was small. "I'm so proud of you. And I'm so sorry I wasn't there to hear it the first time. But I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere. I promise you, I'm not going anywhere ever again." Claire held back, uncertain, protective of both herself and Emma from the possibility of fresh disappointment. But Marcus understood her caution. It was the wisdom born of loving someone who had repeatedly chosen everything else over her. "Claire," he said gently, "I know you have no reason to trust me. I know my promises have been broken too many times. But I died, and in dying, I learned what living actually means. I learned that success without love is just elaborate failure. I learned that I spent 42 years building an empire when what I really needed was to build a home." Over the following weeks, Marcus began the complex process of rebuilding his life with the wisdom that death had given him. He stepped down as CEO of his company, transferring leadership to Sarah, who had been his conscience all along without him realizing it. He restructured his entire business empire to prioritize the human impact that had always existed but never been acknowledged: the employee assistance programs, the charitable foundations, the quiet acts of kindness that had defined his unconscious legacy. But more importantly, Marcus began the delicate work of rebuilding relationships that his previous life had damaged. He attended every one of Emma's college preparation meetings, not as a distracted father checking his phone, but as a present parent asking questions and offering support. He helped her practice for interviews, drove her to campus visits, and listened, really listened, as she shared her dreams, her fears, her hopes for the future. With Claire, the process was more complex. Their marriage had ended for real reasons, and resurrection couldn't erase the years of neglect and disappointment. But Marcus approached their relationship with the patience of someone who had learned that love was not a transaction to be completed quickly, but a garden to be tended daily. He courted her again, not with expensive gifts or grand gestures, but with presence, attention, and consistent small acts of devotion. The most profound changes came in Marcus's daily choices. He discovered that wealth and power were tools, not goals, and he began using them with the intentionality that had been missing from his first life. He established mentorship programs for young entrepreneurs, teaching them not just business strategy but life balance. He created family-centered policies at his companies, ensuring that other fathers wouldn't make his mistakes. He funded research into work-life integration, determined to help others avoid the false choice between success and family that had nearly destroyed him. 6 months after his resurrection, Marcus found himself in the same cathedral where his funeral had been held, but this time for Emma's high school graduation party. The space that had once echoed with regret and lost opportunities now filled with laughter, conversation, and celebration. Roberto was there with Maria, both of them healthy and happy. Sarah was there with her son, whom Marcus now knew by name and cared about as an individual. College friends, employees, neighbors, all the people who had mourned the man he'd been were now celebrating the man he'd become. Emma stood up to give a toast, and Marcus prepared himself for another moment of overwhelming gratitude. 6 months ago, I thought I'd lost my father forever, she began. In some ways, I had: the workaholic, the man who was always rushing to the next meeting, the father who loved me but couldn't figure out how to show it. That man did die. But in his place, I got the father.